Hierarchy is actually necessary, not to create a reporting protocol, but to create that value stream where managers are bringing value to the problem-solving, decision-making of the team. So, consequences of reality, you stand not for what you aspire to, you stand for what you tolerate. The behaviors that survive become our customs and rituals.
Welcome to KPI Fireside. Our mission is simple: to improve companies and to improve careers through continuous improvement. In every episode, we explore the spark, the moment, the mindset, or the method that ignites real change. Whether you're just starting out or leveling up, you'll find the insights and inspiration to fuel your next improvement. Welcome back to KPI Fireside, a continuous improvement podcast. I am your host, Keith Norris. Our guest today is Tom Foster. Tom is an author, a speaker, a longtime business coach to CEOs and senior leaders. Drawing on more than 2 decades of work with executive peer groups, Tom helps leaders better understand structure, accountability, and how people work together. Tom, welcome to the podcast.
Good to be here.
Wonderful. Yeah, as I was mentioning, first became introduced to your work over 10 years ago with the Vistage group that you were brought in to speak in front of, and I was super impressed. At the time, I think I don't know if you sold the book or if I bought this afterwards online, but I've had your book, and this is one that I've referred to many times when making hiring decisions.
One.
Yeah, so I have followed your stuff in various different places. I know you've got a lot of great wisdom. I did read in your bio, you mentioned over 18,000 hours in this work. So you've spent a lot of time here. I'm kind of curious, how did you get started in this? How did you realize this was the path that was going to set you on this direction?
Well, I've been working with Vistage International as a Vistage chair since 1995. So I've got about 31 years in on that. As part of what we do each month, we, of course, gather the group together, and I normally invite a speaker to come in and talk to us. And this particular session, we invited Jerry Harvey, and Jerry was going on, had a talk about the Abilene paradox, but somebody asked him a question and he just stopped dead cold and said, well, your question has nothing to do with the Abilene paradox. But it just so happens that a friend of mine named Elliot Jacks is doing research on exactly what you asked about. And he talked about Elliot for maybe 5 minutes or so. And at that point, that piqued my curiosity. That was in 2001. And over the next 3 years, I began to do more and more reading. I was actually planning to meet up with Elliot, but unfortunately on March 8th, 2003, he passed away. So I just finished reading his last 2 books, but at that point, I realized this is part and parcel of the holy grail of leadership.
That's so interesting. I think that the phrase that comes to mind for me is standing on the shoulders of giants. And I know that a lot of this work, whether it's leadership, organizational design, is building on stuff that came before us. That's super interesting. So tell us a little bit about the work that you do now and what kind of problems you typically are brought into organizations to solve.
Well, when my phone rings, which it keeps doing, I don't know when it'll stop, but I'll keep answering it. Most of the time, people talk to me about, number one is just general people problems. But they hone in on 2 things. One, they think that they see some sort of a breakdown in communication, or there's some sort of a personality conflict going on. And what I find interesting is that Elliot, in his background, did not believe in communication breakdowns, and he didn't believe in personality conflicts. He believed very deeply that it was a misalignment in organizational structure. And if you get your organizational structure right, your issues related to management and motivation disappear almost overnight. So that's what people call me for, but I listen to them for a few minutes, and then I try to reframe where they're coming from, ask them a few questions, and at some point they come to the realization that this is a structural problem. It's not a communication problem.
When it comes to these organization structures, the thing that comes to mind is org charts. And I think org charts have a lot to do with accountability and who a manager is, but maybe not so much about the flow of work or how things work together. What's wrong with these org charts, and what are they missing?
Well, first of all, let's just talk about what is an org chart. So an org chart is nothing more complicated than just it's a mental configuration of the way that we see the deployment of people in the organization. There are not physical lines that run down the hallway that go into somebody's office and attaches to the back of their head. So it's just a mental configuration. And when I look at organizational structure is simply the way that we define working relationships between people. And there are two types of these working relationships, and it all has to do with two words. Both of them start with the letter A. The first word is accountability, and the second word is authority. So when we look at the accountability structure, the two types of working relationships that exist are vertical and horizontal. Now, the vertical working relationships we understand pretty easily. We call those managerial relationships. So every technician or production person knows they've got a supervisor. Every supervisor knows they've got a manager. Every manager knows they've got an executive manager or a VP. Every VP knows they've got a CEO, and many CEOs have a board. And so we understand the accountability and authority that exists in that vertical working relationship. That's the easy stuff. But then we look at two people in the organization that are not each other's manager, yet they need to work together. For example, most companies have a marketing function, and at the top of that marketing function is going to be a marketing manager. And they likely have a sales function, and at the top of that sales function is likely to be a sales manager. So the question is, would it be a good idea for the marketing manager to coordinate with the sales manager? Sure, it's a great idea. And in fact, on the organizational chart, we'll actually draw a special kind of line between those two people. That's a dotted line. Now, the problem with dotted lines is they create ambiguity, and ambiguity kills accountability. So I joke that you need to get rid of your dotted lines. However, companies put those dotted lines there for a noble reason. Those two people have to work together, yet they're not each other's manager. And we hope that they figure out how to work together, but they typically don't. What ends up happening is that's the source of some friction that begins to follow on. The two things that we fail to define in that dotted line is the accountability and the authority. We hope they figure it out. They don't. But if we step back and define that accountability and define that authority, then the friction disappears, and it disappears very, very quickly. So those are the kinds of things that people approach me with. And I often tell them that, I'm more interested in this concept that is very near and dear to my heart, and I hope that they have some appreciation for it. And that concept is something called work. They think they brought me in to help them be warm and fuzzy, solve these communication problems, and rub the personality conflicts. But my main focus is work and getting work done. Now, when I use the word work, I'm talking about two very specific things. Two things that I'm talking about are problem solving and decision making. And that is part and parcel of organizational structure. And begin to look at, there's a big brouhaha about whether or not organizations should be organized in a hierarchy. And actually, hierarchy is a biological thing that's happened over, billions and billions of years. Hierarchies have always existed, and they always exist in the world of work. And so when we look at the different decisions and different problems that exist inside the organization, once we can understand the relative complexity of those decisions, the relative complexity of those problems, then we can begin to understand why hierarchy is actually necessary. So I think you probably agree with me that there are some problems in the world that most people can solve. And yet as the complexity of those problems increases, some of those people will begin to struggle. And we can actually look at complexity and measure that complexity, and then match that with the capability of the people we've assigned to make those decisions and solve those problems. And now all of a sudden we begin to see in that mental configuration a hierarchy emerge that will help us in accountability and authority. Authority to do what? Make decisions or solve problems the way we would have them solved. So all of this begins to come together into a workshop that have delivered, I think now somewhere around 800 deliveries of this workshop on why organizational structure is so critically important as organizations grow and develop and mature through their life cycles.
So what I hear you saying sounds a lot to me through, a lens of Lean Six Sigma, continuous improvement of like value stream mapping and mapping the flow of work through a system. I see you nodding. Are there some better or worse ways to structure an organization to better make work flow in your opinion? Where are some things that are,
So
maybe people.
all of this is going to go part and parcel with just the business model or the design of the organization. Quick and easy example to understand is that if we design a submarine, it's probably because we want to go underwater, because submarines do not fly. By the same token, if we're going to design something that flies, it's going to look more like an airplane than it will a submarine. So the mission of the organization will actually tell us what kind of organization that we need to put together. And so what Elliot Jacks did in his 50 years of research was that he looked at the framework that organizational design sits inside of relative to the problem solving and decision making that has to occur. So when I look at even things like strategy or the construction of a business model, it all has to do with the mission of the organization. And then some of those change over time with technology. And they also change with the life cycle of the organization. Very small organizations will have less complex business models as larger organizations. So when I am approached by an organization, one of my first questions is just to gather some clues. My first question is, what's the head count? You tell me what your head count is. I can tell you the specific kinds of problems that you're going through at that particular time. Or if you tell me what kind of problems that you got, I can tell you approximately how many people you've got in terms of head count. Now, some of that is beginning to be influenced by technology. Artificial intelligence is going to have a big, dramatic impact on that. But organizational structure is, again, just putting that mental configuration of what does our organizational look like and how does work stream through there.
And I think you're referring to these the life cycle stages and the levels of work. So what are some of those milestones? There's sure there's not like an exact number, but what are some of those phases that organizations go through, like where they change when they go from 5 to 50 to 500 people or 50,000 people?
So I get most of my direction on life cycles from an author named Itzhak Adizes. He published a book in 1988 called Corporate Life Cycles. If you learn anything about me, I'm a model guy. Organizational structure, that's who I am. Models have neat boxes and circles and arrows that tell you exactly where to go. And what Adizes did in this particular model is he chronicled the birth of every organization from that entrepreneurial idea in the mind of the founder. And in some cases, that was a hobby, and in some cases, it should have stayed a hobby, but entrepreneurs can't help themselves. They're going to start a business out of it. And then what happens to that organization from the founder's idea and those initial infant organizations and the struggles that always happen. And so he goes through some very specific, there are approximately 5 stages, starting with infancy. Second stage is go-go. When I'm looking at head count, once you're out of startup and you get into go-go, head counts are typically somewhere between 25, 50 people. And when I look at the infant organization, their biggest struggle is always revenue. That's why their strategic focus has to be on sales. In fact, for the startup organization, almost nothing else matters except to make some sales. But with the sustained momentum of revenue, then they can move up to this next level. And I always ask, how many people have told you that they would like to take their company to the next level? And of course, everybody raises their hand. Of course, no one has any real clue as to what that looks like until you follow this particular life cycle model. Getting into go-go with a sustained momentum of revenue, they come out of go-go with this feeling of invincibility. They survived startup and they did not die. So they think they can now go into any business model they so choose and conquer it. In fact, their behavior is extremely reactive. All they see is opportunity. They do not see the problems. And in that reactivity, they see opportunity all over the place, and they can't figure out if they're in the real estate business or the shoe business, because I think they could make money at both with the same sales team in the same headquarters. The biggest elusive characteristic of the go-go organization, however, is profitability. Now, to engage in, of course, the organization is growing in headcount. And, when it started with the founder, in infancy, the founder had high performance standards and met those high performance standards because the founder self performed everything. And one of my trademark questions is there work left over? And the answer to that question is, yep, there's always work left over. So headcount begins to increase, and the founder has to delegate things out to other people. So moving from infancy into go-go, their strategic focus shifts from sales to identifying and documenting methods and processes, but they're still not profitable. The owner or the founder is having some difficulty, as a matter of fact, delegating things out to other people because the founder had such high performance standards. And as he delegates these things out, they just don't meet the same performance standard that he had. So it's a big struggle for the founder to move into this and actually begin to slow things down. When I look at this whole struggle of delegation, what I find is that because it's a struggle for the founder wants to keep that control and actually slows the growth of the organization down. The question is, if all decisions have to go through the founder, what eventually happens to the speed of decision making? The answer is it slows down or can actually stop. If all problems have to be solved by the founder, what happens to the speed of problem solving? And the answer is it slows down or it stops. For the organization to grow, the founder has to delegate things out. But we misunderstand delegation and the purpose for delegation. We think that delegation is a time management tool just to get some stuff off of our plate, when actually it is your most powerful time management tool, but that's not the purpose for delegation. The purpose for delegation is to distribute appropriate problem solving and appropriate decision making to other people in the organization. If the founder doesn't do that, those two things stop. So for the organization to grow, delegation is not about delegating tasks, it's delegating decision making and problem solving. Well, that gets us to go. And then Adizes moves us up to adolescence. Now, remember, infant organizations were in pursuit of revenue. That's why their strategic focus is always about sales. In the pursuit of profitability and distributing work out to other people through the process of delegation, profitability is still elusive. In the pursuit of profitability, we begin to move up into this adolescent stage. Now, think about an adolescent. It's still a teenage company. It's still got pimples all over the place. But in the pursuit of profitability, something happens. And when we define the methods and processes down in the go-go stage, we thought the right sequence was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, because that's how we learned to count in school. However, we're not making a profit. But if we stare at that workflow and realize that if we resequence those steps, not 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but 1, 5, 4, 2, 3, suddenly we become profitable because suddenly we begin to see efficiency, consistency, and predictability. The adolescent stage actually requires a system focus that has resequenced our methods and processes into a system that is now efficient and predictable. And then we've got profitability. But guess what we just created? The platform for our next set of problems. The organization grows. Adizes now calls this the prime stage. A prime stage means the pimples are beginning to go away. We have not only a system or core system, but we now begin to develop other more robust systems inside the organization. So we end up with a marketing system. We end up with a sales system, a project management system, an operational system, quality control system. So now we have these multiple systems and subsystems that begin to populate the organization. And you can imagine that the organizational structure at this level of work is way different than the founder at the very beginning who hired some friends and family to come in and do a little bit of everything. We now have people who have grown up into roles. Those roles have grown up into teams. We organize those teams into functions, departments, and now we sit them next to each other and watch the work flow through. And in the beginning, it is not pretty. There's typically an internal focus in each of these internal systems. In fact, you may look at these internal systems. You've probably at some point in your career called them silos.
Silos.
And what have we
Absolutely.
been told to do with our silos?
Break down the silos. Break down the silos.
So remember a guy named Ken Blanchard
Yeah, yeah.
wrote a book,
One minute manager guy.
The 1 Minute Manager guy.
Yeah.
Well, the cover of one of his latest books says you got to be a silo buster. Now, with all due respect to Ken Blanchard, he has no idea what he's talking about. You see, you put those silos there for a very specific reason. Operations, you want totally focused, efficient, internally profitable on operations. Sales, you want head down, nose to the
Yeah. You
grindstone.
need focus.
You need them internally focused on sales. So it's not a matter of breaking down your silos, it's a matter of integrating them together. And now we begin to look at the workflow. We've got probably at this point somewhere between 100 and 500 people. And this platform of problems, let's just describe it as friction between the various functions inside the organization. And so the strategic focus now shifts not from a system focus, because now we've got more than one system, but now an integration focus where we integrate these systems and subsystems together. So when I look at integration, there's two things that I look at. First, just to acknowledge work moves sideways through the organization. It starts with marketing and goes to sales, goes from sales to project management, goes from project management to operations. And every time it moves from one function to the next function, there's a handoff. So the first thing that I look at in terms of integration is to inspect the handoffs. In fact, if you're looking at like a construction company, between sales, which they call estimating, between sales and project management, because in estimating, the project lives in the imagination of the estimator. But when we get the contract, we've got to translate that imaginary project into steel, rebar, bricks, mortar, all that stuff. And so there's a handoff meeting between the estimator and the project manager. And it's in that handoff that if there's a ball that's dropped, we're not going to find out until we're pouring concrete and running steel. So these handoff meetings are critically important. So the output of marketing becomes the input for sales, and the output for sales becomes the input for project management. The output for project management becomes the input for operations. So when I look at integration, the first thing I look at is outputs and inputs, outputs and inputs, outputs and inputs as work moves sideways through the organization. Well, that's only one source of friction. The other source of friction when I look at integration has to do with the capacity output of one function as it sits next to its neighboring function. Is it possible for sales to sell so much stuff that operations struggles to fulfill?
Yeah, certainly. Now we're getting into the idea of theory of constraints. You've got a bottleneck somewhere in your system, right?
Right. And so when we begin to look at that, the question is, by the way, I call that a high class problem, too much in sales
Too much
that we have
sales. Yeah, that's a good problem.
trouble keeping up with it.
There's worse
And
problems.
so, but if we struggle to throughput those things, what happens to some of those sales orders? Some of those sales orders turn into back orders. And if we continue to struggle to fill those back orders, our back orders turn into canceled orders. So you go to look at, well, what's the problem? And first thing that people come up with, well, this is a communication problem. If sales had just more clearly communicated to operations, then we wouldn't have this problem. Or if operations had more clearly communicated their constraints to sales, we wouldn't have this problem. Or it even looks like a personality conflict. Sales manager doesn't like the operations manager, or the operations manager doesn't like the sales manager. But Elliot would come along and say, no, you do not have a communication breakdown. You do not have a personality conflict. What you have is a structural problem at level 4. This is all about integration, where you have one function that is outstripping the capacity output of its neighboring function. And if we flip that example backwards and say that, no, in operations, we actually have a crackerjack operational team. We have the greatest, latest state-of-the-art equipment. We're able to crank out finished goods like there's no tomorrow. But if our sales are somewhat anemic, it's not like they're making no sales, but they're not selling all of our finished goods. So where are we putting the unsold finished goods? Inventory.
Inventory somewhere.
And where are we putting that inventory? In the warehouse.
Warehouse, taking up
Until the
space,
warehouse
cost of
gets
money.
what?
It's
full.
full, yeah.
So
Costs money.
now what do? We build
Buy
another
it, build another one.
warehouse. That's what we do. So what's happening to cost of goods sold? It's going.
Increasing,
Yes.
cost increasing.
So what's the problem? Again, it looks like a communication problem. If we just communicated more clearly, we wouldn't have that problem. Or the personality conflict comes back up again. But Elliot would arrive on the scene and say, no, this is a structural problem where you have to optimize the output capacity of all the systems inside the organization. So now it's a matter of not just having a high performing core system, it's now a matter of total organizational throughput. So that all happens at level 4. That's integrating those silos together. Don't get rid of them. You put them there for a noble reason. It's a matter of integrating them together, looking at outputs and inputs, and looking at the output capacity and optimizing. But guess what? Organizations get bigger and they move up to another level. And there's a huge shift here. Now, everything we've been talking about so far is all stuff that is inside the organization. But now we have to look at the outside the organization. If we have these internal systems, there are also some external systems. Now, the most important external system out there we could call the market. Now, your market is made up of you. It's made up of your customers. It's made up of your vendors. It's made up of your competitors. That's your market. And you don't control that market. You just play in that market. And that external system now begins to have an impact on the way you have to internally organize. And so as things move, technology comes in, things like that, regulation, financial regulation, environmental regulation, that's an external system. Finance is typically an external system, lines of credit, term loans, things like that. You go to the bank to borrow some money and they say, sure, how much do you need? And you tell them, well, we need as much as we can get. And they go, well, that's okay, but we're only going to loan you as much as we think you have the ability to repay. But they also have these things called covenants. And you probably know what happens if you break a covenant with the bank, even if you have the ability to repay, what happens?
Well, they don't like to keep lending you money.
Right. They put you in a category called special assets, which does not mean that you are special. So these external systems begin to have an impact on the way we internally organize. I used to work for a CPA firm, spent about 10 years in there. Started in 1986, personal computer was just coming on the scene. But before we were able to install those personal computers, we had a huge bookkeeping department. We had big 13-column green pad paper, adding machines, everything was manually done. We had probably, 10, 12 people in our bookkeeping department just doing bookkeeping for our clients. 10 years later, personal computers came in. We had helped deploy those personal computers out into our client base. So guess how many bookkeepers we had at that point?
Not as many.
Zero. So things change, technology changes, and the design of your organization will also change. So levels of work helps us to understand where the work is, what's the nature of that work, meaning nature of problem solving, nature of decision making, what has to be done. And then as we restructure the organization, levels of work helps guide us to make sure that we're staffed where we need the problem solving and decision.
Are you struggling to ignite real change in your continuous improvement program? Firestarter is your field guide. Real stories, proven strategies, no fluff. Get it now on Amazon. I'm assuming that understanding how these levels of work impact, how a company grows and shifting people between them, giving them, you might say, like career path opportunities to move between them. Like anything, if you're used to the job, it's probably easy, but when you've been asked to do something new that things probably get a little bit complicated. What are maybe some of the things that people need to understand about that organizational design or the accountability or the delegation of putting somebody new in a role that are maybe some of the gotchas or things to know?
So as organizations grow, and I'll talk about a couple of things, let's just talk about organic growth, and then let's talk a little bit about mergers and acquisitions. So organic growth, we have a company that's growing and they're growing. And is it possible that the people that were there at the very beginning with the founder, that the company might outgrow them? Marshall Goldsmith has a book, and the title of the book is Those People Who Got You Here Won't Get You There. And so as the organization grows from 5 people to 50 people to 500 people to 5,000 people, I was working with a company in Monterrey, Mexico, 25,000 people. As the organization grows, the decisions become more complex, the problems become more complex. Some people will be able to track through that complexity growth. Some people will not. But even if those people are able to track and grow, they're going to leave a void behind them that has to be backfilled. And if we don't backfill it accurately with people who have the capability to make those decisions and solve those problems, that manager who may be elevated up into a level 4 role is going to get dragged into the weeds back down into stratum level of work 3. So as organizations grow, we truly have to backfill those positions that people are elevated from, or we may also have to go to the outside because there may be nobody in the organization that can handle that complexity. I also look at, have you ever watched a company grow, and then bump their head against the ceiling and they stop? Typically, my first question is, who's the CEO? I want to talk to the CEO. Company growth stops at the growth limit of the CEO. Very often you'll look at a CEO and they might want to say, okay, I'm done. I've taken this as far as I can go. I need to turn this over to professional management. So private equity comes in and they bring some professional managers in and those kinds of things happen. So just from an organic growth, looking at these different levels of work, designing the organizational model and structure to support the mission and vision of the company, critically important to get that right. Now let's take a look at mergers and acquisitions. This is not organic growth. This is fast growth. We can grow a lot faster if we just buy someone, buy a competitor, or buy someone who's got some synergism with our organization. When we look at mergers and acquisitions, there's typically 2 types of due diligence that happens. There's financial due diligence, because if the numbers don't make sense, then what's the point? But if the numbers do make sense, the second type of due diligence is culture due diligence. What's the company culture like there? What's our company culture? Will those company cultures mesh together? But there's a third type of due diligence that I talk about called level of work due diligence. So as you're looking at an acquisition, to do an assessment of the level of work that's inside that organization, figure out, who's at level 1, 2, 3, and 4. Are there players that are going to stay with the company, or are there players that are going to leave the company in the acquisition? And then also looking internally at our own level of work. Do we have level of work sufficient to digest that acquisition? So it's a completely different organizational structure assessment in mergers and acquisitions that needs to sit side by side with cultural assessments and financial assessment.
That's interesting. The culture piece is a super intriguing concept. Curious about some of those behavior patterns that exist in cultures where they're better at navigating, through that growth.
Just so happens that I wrote a book recently called Premeditated Culture. And the premise of the book, and it's a fictional account, so it's a business novel, so it's readable and fun, and it's a story. But the premise of the book is that organizational structure sets your culture. I introduce something called the culture cycle. The culture cycle is made up of 4 pieces. So if you just imagine a circle, at the top of the circle are beliefs and assumptions, the way that we see the world. So if you go 90 degrees off on that circle, those beliefs and assumptions drive behaviors. So all the behaviors that we would like to see in the culture are driven from what it is that we believe. The bottom part of the cycle is that those behaviors are tested by the consequences of reality. Some of those behaviors survive that test, and those that survive become our customs and our rituals. That's the 9 o'clock on the culture cycle. Those customs and rituals then reinforce our beliefs and assumptions. So to quickly go through that with an example, remember I told you I'm not a warm and fuzzy guy. I'm here to
Sure.
get some work done. So everybody thinks that culture is about being warm and fuzzy, but let's say that we would like to have a safety culture. If we're going to have a safety culture, what is it that we believe? To make this real simple, 10 fingers, 10 toes. We believe that every team member needs to go home at the end of each and every day with 10 fingers and 10 toes. If that's what we believe, what is our behavior? We're going to wear personal protective equipment. We're going to set up perimeters on the top of roofs so we don't walk off the edge of a roof. We're going to have wear work gloves. We're going to watch out for each other. We may have a safety manager, but we only have one safety manager. If we've got 10 job sites, can't be everywhere. So we empower everybody to be a safety monitor, to be our brother's keeper, to watch out for safety concerns. So those are the behaviors. So that's the 3 o'clock on the cycle. But remember, those behaviors are tested by the consequences of reality. Your best guy shows up on the job site. He was drinking the night before, so he didn't have time to go home to get his steel-toed shoes. He shows up in tennis shoes. What do you do?
Do you let him stay? Do you send him home?
Yep. You see, everyone says, what we believe, what we aspire to, our values and all that sort of thing. Those are aspirational. However, it's not what you aspire to, it's what you tolerate. So the
Is
name
that
of
what
my
you're
book,
getting at when you say delegating decision making and process at some of the levels? Like, okay, this is a decision that somebody needs to make at that level.
right. And if it's made too low, then you actually create a precedent that we're going to allow people to come in their tennis shoes. Oh, it's just for one day. And pretty soon now everybody's coming in their tennis shoes because steel-toed boots are uncomfortable. So consequences of reality, you stand not for what you aspire to, you stand for what you tolerate. The behaviors that survive become our customs and rituals, like daily safety meetings, 5 minutes. We're going to talk about site-specific safety exposure today. We have those safety meetings how often? Every day. So it becomes a custom and a ritual. Those customs and rituals then reinforce our beliefs that every team member needs to go home at the end of each and every day with 10 fingers, 10 toes. So that's the culture cycle that's embedded in this book. If you look at other things that we believe because of our discipline of levels of work and where we make decisions and how we make decisions and how people learn and how people solve problems. Now you begin to define other sets of behaviors, again, tested by the consequences of reality. Those that survive become customs and rituals.
And I think one of the things that I'm hearing or perhaps connecting some dots on with what you said is this idea that the right strategy um, has a lot to do with the stage that a company might be at. Like there's particular strategic focuses that make a lot of sense in one stage, but might not be as appropriate in later stages in the life cycle.
Sure. If you're running, let's say, a level 4 company where we've got multiple silos and we have to look at the constraints inside those silos and we're looking for total organizational throughput, I mean, sales is important, but if you want to scale the organization, you've got to really look at your integration and scaling. And I know lots of companies that, we'd like to build a company that can scale. And it's like, well, good luck with that. You're going to have to build it up to level 4 because scalability doesn't happen until level 4 hits. To get all of your silos integrated together, looking at outputs and inputs, and then looking at output capacity in each of those silos as they sit next to each other. So while sales is important, you're not going to scale just because of sales. In fact, if you scale too much with sales and you don't have the integration piece done, you'll go on what I call a statistical fluctuation. You'll build it up, the wheels get wobbly, you'll have to come back down. Then you'll build it up again, wheels get wobbly, you got to come back down. So yeah, the strategic focus of an organization depends on where they are in the life cycle, specific things that they have to pay attention to.
Yeah, very interesting. With I'm curious if we think about just say a manager who's delegating work and could talk to some tips or some advice about how to make them more successful in being able to delegate, what are some of the things that they should be thinking of? Is there a framework, a model? Like, do the metrics change that you're measuring on somebody? You were talking about like the goals. Sounds like the goals shift. Maybe the units that the goals are measuring or something. How do they shift between the levels?
As the level of work goes up, obviously the time span of those goals and objectives get longer, which introduces more complexity, introduces more uncertainty, introduces more ambiguity. And of course, as people get promoted through the career ladders, one of the major purposes for delegation is to test people for their ability to solve problems and make decisions. And obviously, as these decisions and problems become more complex, they may be able to solve problems at one level of work, but not solve problems at the next level of work. And now all of a sudden let's say we've got a hole on the team. Somebody got promoted or somebody left or somebody quit. We now have a hole on the team. The question is, who do we promote? If we have not been constantly delegating project work to our team members, and testing them for capability, we have no clue who's going to be ready to step up. It's a trial and error decision. And yet, if we've been constantly delegating things to where people can demonstrate their capability, their ability to solve problems and make decisions at that level of complexity, now we know who's ready to step up. So it is not just something that would be nice to delegate things to other people. It's absolutely critical when we look at internal succession inside the organization as it grows, because life happens as time goes by. Or we grow and we now create a whole new level of work that we didn't have in the organization before. Who's ready to step up? And we test people and their capability through project work. And
Love that
embedding in those
idea.
projects the decision-making and problem-solving that we're testing for. And they will either be successful or they will fail. Now, if they fail, guess what? They still have a job. It was just a test. By the way, if they fail, we're going to put them right back where they were before. But what are we going to do 3 months later? We're going to test them again. So it's a constant project testing everybody on the team so that when we need somebody to move, we know where the capability is.
I love this concept of project work and the idea that somebody can have a day job. You've got your whatever level 1, level 2, whatever level it is work, but project is something in addition to like your normal job that you have this opportunity to participate in, work on, make an impact on, and it's a way for the organization to test you out and see how you handle some additional responsibility.
And it doesn't have to be some oddball project. Let's say that we've got a lead technician. So technician is typically a stratum 1 role. He's your lead technician, which means he's high stratum 1. Anybody else on the team has a problem, they usually go to the lead tech first before they go to their supervisor. So we're looking at this lead tech, best guy you've got at level 1. And our curiosity is, does this guy have emerging level 2 capability? Now, the tools are different, right? Tools at level 2 are different than the tools at level 1. Level 1, it's all about real tools, machinery, and equipment. Level 2, it's all about schedules and checklists. So I might give this lead technician a project. I'd like him to sit down and do a 2-week look-ahead schedule for every team member, and he's going to have to go talk to each team member, make sure that no one's taken off vacation or sick time. I also want him to look at all of the raw materials that are going to be used over the next 2 weeks, lead times on all those raw materials, consumables, maybe, personal protection equipment, consumables, things like that. Need him to put all the preventive maintenance schedules in there and also look at our machine uptime, things like that. Give me a schedule for a 2-week look ahead. Have it on my desk tomorrow afternoon at 3:00. We'll sit down and we'll talk about it. Now, if he does a lousy job, are we going to fire him? No, he's our best lead tech.
Put him back in what he was doing great at.
Yeah. If he does do a good job, what does that tell us? He might have capability to move in as an emerging supervisory role using schedules and checklists. So next project is going to be, let's do a 1-month look ahead. Again, same thing. So it doesn't have to be just some oddball project. It's stuff that we're doing all the time, every day, just increasing the complexity so that he now has to imagine the uncertainty and the ambiguity of what's going to be happening for the next 2 to 4 weeks into the future.
I love that. I think that's a great example of how to test some of these ways to move the business, the organization forward. And it sounds like that's all turning something into a project is a great place to let good ideas for problem solving come from too, because it might have been that lead tech that had that idea of this new thing to do.
Exactly.
Great. That's great. Well, Tom, I'd like to move into a little section here we call the rapid fire. These are just a few kind of quick, short questions, top of mind answers here.
Okay.
All right. The most important job of a leader is to
Build the team.
team. Do you have a favorite go-to problem-solving tool in your toolbox over the years? One that you turn to?
Well, when I look at problem solving and when I look at work, part of work is solving problems. I don't look at a specific problem solving tool as much as I look at different problem solving methods. And there are different problem solving methods that go along with levels of work. Stratum level of work 1 problem solving method is typically trial and error. Level 2 problem solving is now looking at documented experience. And documented experience normally falls as standard operating procedures. Problem solving at stratum 3 is root cause analysis. Level 4, remember level 4, system integration, multi-system integration, is now system analysis. Not just root cause analysis, but system analysis, where one system is having an impact or an influence on its neighboring systems. Then you look up at level 5. Remember, level 5 is no longer looking just inside. Level 5 is now looking outside. So it's not root cause analysis. It's not just system analysis. It is typical external system analysis like market analysis. So when I look at problem solving, no specific tool. I just look at the different levels of methodologies that are appropriate at each level of work, because there is appropriate problem solving and appropriate decision making made at each level of work.
You mentioned a few different books. I want to give you a chance to talk about any books that you mentioned a few of your own. Any books book recommendation you want to share with us?
Well, hiring is always a big topic. And so in 2013, I got tired of repeating myself. And so I wrote a book called Hiring Talent, which uses level of work. That's the one you've got up on your shelf there. Then I wrote a book called Outbound Air, which is a business novel that illustrates levels of work, each of the 5 levels of work, and chronicles a fictitious airplane flight operation, as it goes through and grows up through all the life cycles that we talked about and the predictable characteristics of the problems that they ran into. Now, I picked airline operations because in an airline operation, work matters. They do their job well. The airplane flies and lands. They do their job poorly. People die. So work matters. And then the last book that I just now wrote, and it's about levels of work and how they create your culture using that culture cycle. That organizational structure is really the framework for culture.
How about, do you have a favorite question?
Given a question to me, my favorite question is always, who's the manager?
Who's the manager?
That's my favorite question. Someone's going to come to me. They're going to have some predicament. Somebody's not getting along with somebody else. Somebody's underperforming. How can we coach them up? I don't even want to talk to the person. I just want to know who the manager is, because it's the manager that I hold accountable for the output of the person.
Is there something that you believe to be true about management, the job of a manager that is maybe not commonly understood or not commonly believed?
So I usually pose a trick question to groups that I work with. I say, who here has direct reports? And of course, everybody raises their hand. And then I ask them, so you think you're a manager so people can report to you? And they go, well, yeah, but you're going somewhere with this. Yes, I'm going
Trick
somewhere with
question.
this. You're not a manager so people can report to you. That is not a function of management. In fact, here's the truth. Everybody reports to lots of people in the organization. Management very little to do with reporting. Organizational structure has very little to do with reporting. We think that that org chart is so we know who reports to who. That's not what the org chart is there for. The function of a manager is to bring value to the work of the team member, meaning more specifically, to bring value to the problem solving and decision making of the team member. That's the function of management. That's why hierarchy exists. Organizational structure is to embed in the organization time span capability in managers so that they can bring value to problem solving and decision making of their team members. That's why hierarchy is necessary. People try to flatten the organization out. So we don't need these managers. And it's like, oh, really? Who's going to bring value to the problem solving and decision making of the team when they run into a problem? They go, well, didn't really think of it that way. So it's a different way to look at organizational structure, the purpose for organizational structure, the purpose for hierarchy in organizational structure. Hierarchy is actually necessary, not to create a reporting protocol, but to create that value stream where managers are bringing value to the problem solving decision making of the team.
Well, this has been great. I really appreciate you coming on with us and sharing your models, your frameworks, your wisdom, the insights and the stories. This has been a really great conversation. I really appreciate you coming here. Is there some resources or how you want to share, like a website, or how folks can follow up with you or follow you or get in touch with you?
Easiest way to follow me and get inside my head is I publish a blog. I've been publishing since 2004. I know everybody wants to publish a blog, but I've been publishing now for 22 years. Comes out 3 times a week. It's typically a 30-second read. It's at managementblog.org. So managementblog, all one word, .org, O-R-G. And there's links on that blog to all kinds of other things, to all the books and some other things that I do. But that's the central piece.
Excellent. Well, Tom, thanks again so much for joining us. I really appreciate your time, making time for us in your schedule and sharing some of your wisdom with us. Thanks so much.
All right. Take care.
And for our listeners, if you'd like to suggest a guest, ask a question, or give any ideas for episodes or content, you can reach out to me, Keith Norris, on LinkedIn. And this concludes this episode of KPI Fireside, a continuous improvement podcast. If you have enjoyed the episode today, be sure to add a comment, like, follow, subscribe on all the socials. You can share it with your friends or colleagues who are as passionate about continuous improvement as you are. You can find us wherever you get your podcast. And until next time, keep driving progress and sparking change. This episode is brought to you by KPI Fire, the all-in-one platform for continuous improvement. With KPI Fire, you can align strategy, drive execution, and engage your people. So whether you're leading a team or driving enterprise-wide change, KPI Fire helps you deliver real results. Learn more at www.kpifire.com.